On a cold Sunday morning, 3rd of February 1912, in the Walsh McLean house on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C., the dining room smelled faintly of orchids and coffee. On the oval table, Evalyn Walsh McLean adjusted a low bowl of white roses, turning each bloom so it faced the expected guests. Light from the stained glass ceiling of the great hall filtered in, catching on the blue fire of the Hope diamond resting against her lace bodice. A society columnist from the New York Times would later note that at a brilliant reception that evening, the famous stone was seen for the first time in public since it changed owners. As she leaned over the flowers, the diamond shifted, heavy on its platinum setting, a private weight beneath the sparkle. The roses, perfectly arranged, concealed the strategy. Beauty as armor, hospitality as influence, extravagance as performance. She smiled at the footman, but her fingers didn't leave the petals. Elegance, in this house, would always need tending. In the late summer of 1896, in Ouray, Colorado, a mining town nestled in the San Juan Mountains where silver had already made and broken several fortunes, 12-year-old Evalyn Walsh stood outside a rough timber mining office as her father, Thomas F. Walsh, returned from the Camp Bird mine holding assay papers that would transform their lives. That year, the once modest Irish immigrant carpenter turned prospector discovered one of the richest gold veins in the United States, a strike that would soon yield approximately $5,000 per day in high-grade ore and establish the Walsh family among America's newest multimillionaires. In her memoir, Father Struck It Rich, published decades later in 1936, Evalyn recalled the moment with characteristic directness. "Daughter, I've struck it rich." The phrase captured both the suddenness of the transformation and its almost violent disruption of their previous life. With those assay papers documenting gold content that exceeded even optimistic projections, the family's existence shifted abruptly from boarding houses where rent was a constant worry and hotel corridors where they lived between mining camps to travel trunks lined with silk and steamship tickets for extended European tours. The sound of ore carts rumbling through mountain tunnels and the perpetual dust of mining operations would soon be replaced by the rattle of carriage wheels on paved Washington streets and the rustle of expensive fabric in Fifth Avenue dressmakers' shops. An early photograph from this period, preserved in family archives, shows Evalyn in a high-necked dress of modest cut, her dark hair pulled back severely, captured at the exact threshold between two worlds. A girl whose childhood had been marked by her father's restless pursuit of mineral wealth and whose future would be defined by the consequences of finally finding it. The fortune that poured from Camp Bird, eventually totaling millions of dollars before the mine was sold, would purchase marble mansions, legendary jewels including the Hope diamond, and guaranteed entry into the highest circles of American and European society. But it would also purchase something less tangible and more burdensome: expectations of constant poise, strategic generosity, and unwavering public composure that would define and constrain Evalyn's adult life. The cause and effect was already clear to observers, even if not yet to the girl herself. Her father's seam of gold running through Colorado mountain rock would become the very architecture of her existence, the foundation upon which her social position, her marriage prospects, her daily routines, and ultimately her tragedies would be constructed. The narrator observes that before Evalyn had learned to navigate Washington drawing rooms or select appropriate jewels for diplomatic receptions, the essential pattern was established. Wealth extracted from Western mountains would be converted into Eastern social capital, mining fortune transformed into cultural legitimacy, with a young girl as the primary instrument and display of that transformation. By 1903, the Walsh family had decisively left the Colorado mountains behind and planted themselves in the nation's capital, on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C., the emerging corridor where new American fortunes competed to build ever more impressive private palaces. Masons, carpenters, and artisans from multiple trades completed work on the 60-room mansion that Thomas Walsh had commissioned as both residence and monument. The structure was an eclectic Beaux-Arts composition featuring a grand mahogany staircase that Walsh insisted be modeled after an ocean liner's promenade deck. a detail that suggested both his pride in transatlantic travel and his desire to incorporate the latest symbols of modern luxury into domestic architecture. Society pages in the Washington Evening Star, the Washington Post, and other newspapers devoted extensive coverage to the mansion's completion, marveling at the scale of its ballroom, the authenticity of its French salon with panels imported from Paris, and the reported $2 million spent on furnishings shipped from European capitals. A historic American building survey conducted decades later would carefully document the construction cost, $835,000 for the structure alone, an enormous sum for residential architecture, and would also record the dry assessment of at least one Washington grande dame who found the house very good, very rich, and very ugly, a judgment that captured both the mansion's undeniable quality and expense and its failure to achieve the understated elegance that old money families prized above ostentation. Inside these elaborate rooms, teenage Evalyn began learning to move through spaces explicitly designed to display her, as much as the imported artwork and custom furniture. The rustle of silk skirts against the mahogany stair rail, the glow of gaslight and later electric chandeliers, reflecting off carved wall paneling, the echo of multiple voices rising toward the stained glass dome that crowned the central hall. Each sensory detail functioned as part of her ongoing education in performing her role as heiress and future society hostess. Her mother, Carrie Bell Walsh, a former schoolteacher from Pennsylvania who had married the prospector when both were struggling, now oversaw the intricate machinery of social position. Calling cards engraved with precise lettering, dinner invitation lists that balanced political necessity with social compatibility, and the exacting protocols for thank you notes that had to be written within 24 hours of any entertainment received. At the frequent receptions held to introduce the family to Washington society and to establish Thomas Walsh as a figure worthy of diplomatic and political attention, tall vases of roses and lilies lined every mantelpiece and side table. Evalyn, observing her mother's careful preparations, began assisting with these flower arrangements, a small ritual that taught her how order and beauty could be imposed on cut stems and transient blooms, and how visual harmony required constant attention and adjustment. Refinement, she was discovering, was not a natural state but a constructed one, requiring daily labor to maintain. The narrator reflects that even before she owned any famous jewel, even before her name appeared in international society columns, the house itself on Massachusetts Avenue was teaching Evalyn fundamental lessons: how to move gracefully through rooms designed for observation, how to smile at servants while maintaining appropriate social distance, and how not to stumble or reveal uncertainty when hundreds of eyes were assessing every gesture for signs of whether mining wealth could truly be converted into social legitimacy. On 19th of August, 1905, in Newport, Rhode Island, the summer colony where America's wealthiest families maintained elaborate cottages and competed to host the season's most exclusive entertainments, an electric automobile carrying members of the Walsh family skidded on a coastal road with catastrophic results. Evalyn, not yet 20 years old and already becoming a recognized figure in Washington society, was in the vehicle when her older brother, Vincent Walsh, lost control. He was killed almost instantly in the crash. Evalyn survived but suffered severe injuries, including a crushed leg that required immediate surgery and would never fully heal, leaving her with a permanent limp and chronic pain that would shadow the rest of her life. Contemporary newspaper accounts and later biographical studies document that she underwent serious operations in the accident's aftermath and developed a dependence on morphine, the standard medical treatment for severe pain in the early 20th century, but one that carried risks of addiction that doctors were only beginning to understand. This dependence on pain medication, initially a medical necessity, would later become a more complex and troubling pattern as she faced subsequent tragedies and stresses. The accident, recorded in both newspapers of the time and recalled decades later in her memoir with a mixture of grief and matter-of-fact acceptance, marked the first unmistakable shadow falling across the Walsh fortune, a reminder that wealth could not guarantee safety or prevent sudden, violent loss. Back in Washington, after the family returned from Newport with one son dead and a daughter seriously injured, visitors entering the Massachusetts Avenue mansion passed the same monumental mahogany staircase and encountered the same elaborate flower arrangements that had greeted them before. But now a formal portrait of the lost son joined the family photographs displayed in the drawing rooms. The social calendar continued without significant interruption. Concerts in the music room, diplomatic receptions in the ballroom, visits from European royalty, including King Leopold II of Belgium, whose presence was documented in contemporary society coverage. But within the household itself, grief and anxiety altered the emotional atmosphere, even as the external performances of hospitality and refinement continued with apparent seamlessness. At these post-accident receptions and dinners, Evalyn still moved through the rooms adjusting flower arrangements on mantelpieces and side tables, ensuring that each vase displayed its contents to best advantage. The gesture, which had once been a playful participation in household preparations, now carried different emotional weight, a small, repeated effort to impose order and beauty on a world that had proven itself fundamentally unsafe and unpredictable, despite all the protections that money could seemingly provide. The narrator observes that when Thomas Walsh's fortune purchased speed, when it bought the latest electric automobiles and allowed his children to travel the fashionable Newport roads at what were then considered dangerous velocities, it also purchased risk and vulnerability that no amount of wealth could subsequently undo. The curse that would later be attributed to the Hope Diamond, the superstitious explanation that would attach itself to the family's subsequent tragedies, had not yet entered their lives. This first devastating loss involved no legendary gem or supernatural explanation, only the modern dangers of automotive transportation and the random cruelty of mechanical failure and human error. If there was a curse operating in the Walsh family's life, it had manifested well before any famous blue diamond entered their possession. Around 1899 through 1900, the Walsh family spent extended periods in Paris, where Evalyn, approximately 14 years old, was nominally enrolled for singing lessons, a respectable reason for a wealthy American girl to study in France, suggesting cultural refinement and appropriate feminine accomplishment. In her memoir, Father Struck It Rich, written with characteristic frankness about her own youthful rebellions, Evalyn later admitted that the City of Light offered considerably more than musical education. She experimented with coloring her hair, used rouge and other cosmetics that would have been scandalous for an American girl of respectable family, and tasted a degree of social freedom and personal experimentation that would never have been available to her under Washington society's stricter observational gaze. She did receive the expected instruction that formed the standard curriculum for wealthy young American women abroad. Formal French language lessons that would allow her to converse comfortably with European aristocrats and diplomats, piano instruction that reinforced earlier musical training, and the essential art of formal correspondence, learning to write letters and notes in both English and French that conveyed appropriate gratitude, maintained suitable social distance, and never revealed anything that might compromise her reputation or her family's standing. Receipts and invoices from Parisian and Brussels dealers, preserved in estate records and later examined by historians of the Walsh family, document extensive purchases of custom gowns, decorative watercolors and aquarelles for the Washington mansion, and furniture and textiles that would be shipped back to Massachusetts Avenue as evidence of the family's European sophistication and refined taste. In letters written home during these Paris sojourns, few complete examples survive, but fragments and references appear in her memoir and in family correspondence retained by relatives. Evalyn described opera houses where she sat in velvet-lined boxes, broad boulevards where fashionable crowds promenaded beneath gas lamps, and the Luxembourg Gardens where aristocratic children played under the supervision of uniformed nannies. The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones, the play of gaslight on mirrored cafe walls, the pervasive smell of flowers in formal gardens and market stalls, all became part of her education in how to appear comfortable and at ease in any European or American drawing room, how to move through international social spaces as though she had always belonged there, rather than being the daughter of an Irish immigrant who struck gold in the Colorado mountains. The same Parisian education that gave Evelyn fluency in French and familiarity with European social customs also reinforced a fundamental rule that governed the lives of wealthy young women. Personal delight and experimental freedom were permissible within carefully bounded limits, but only as long as reputation remained completely intact and no scandal ever touched the family name. The balance was delicate and required constant awareness. Enough independence to suggest modern American confidence, enough restraint to maintain European-style respectability. The narrator observes that, by the time Evelyn left Paris and returned to Washington to assume her adult role in capital society, she had learned two parallel curricula: the official lessons in languages, arts, and manners that prepared her for diplomatic entertaining and international social life, and the unofficial education in how much freedom a wealthy woman could claim without damaging the carefully constructed facade that her father's fortune had purchased. Returning permanently to Washington in the early 1900s, Evelyn Walsh came of age in a capital city where political power and social influence were inextricably intertwined, where diplomatic receptions and congressional events provided the settings for negotiations that shaped national and international policy. The Walsh Mansion on Massachusetts Avenue, regularly featured in society pages of the Washington Post and other newspapers, functioned as a venue for hosting ambassadors representing European powers, senators whose votes determined legislation, cabinet members who shaped executive policy, and visiting royalty whose presence conferred additional prestige on the family's already substantial wealth. Contemporary descriptions from society columns and architectural histories, including the detailed Historic American Building Survey conducted decades later, emphasize the mansion's almost theatrical design. A three-story entrance hall with the famous mahogany staircase designed to evoke an ocean liner's grand promenade, a music room containing a massive pipe organ where professional musicians performed at evening entertainments, and a ballroom with elaborate plasterwork ceilings where full orchestras could play under electric chandeliers that represented the latest in modern luxury. Within these carefully designed spaces, Evelyn practiced the demanding curriculum of elite social performance, the precise angle at which to incline her head when introduced to an ambassador, the carefully modulated tone appropriate for dinner conversation that acknowledged serious political topics without pretending to offer opinions that might be considered unfeminine or inappropriate, and the exact timing of social visits and the proper protocol for calling cards and return visits that governed Washington's intricate social machinery. Her mother Carrie's meticulously maintained social calendar functioned as a living etiquette manual, documenting not only who visited and who must be visited in return, but the relative importance of different social obligations, the calculation of how long to remain at various types of entertainments, and the crucial question of precedence: who should be seated where at dinners, who should be introduced to whom first, which social debts were most urgent to repay. These seemingly trivial details carried genuine political and social consequences. The wrong seating arrangement could insult a foreign minister, while a missed visit could signal a deliberate social cut that might create lasting enmity. Photographs from this period, preserved in both family collections and newspaper archives, show Evelyn in fashionable lace evening gowns and substantial pearl necklaces, often seated beside her father, whose rough prospector's hands rest somewhat awkwardly on formal chair arms. The visual contrast between his working-class origins and their current luxurious surroundings still evident despite expensive tailoring. The sensory details of these evening receptions created their own kind of ritual: the rustle of silk and taffeta gowns moving across polished parquet floors, the mingled scent of expensive cigars and the beeswax polish used on mahogany furniture, and the constant presence of elaborate fresh flower arrangements that required daily attention from household staff and frequent personal adjustment from Evelyn herself. At the end of each day filled with social obligations, she retreated to a private sitting room to write the mandatory thank you notes on heavy cream stationery embossed with her monogram, each note carefully phrased to express appropriate gratitude while maintaining the tone of someone acknowledging a pleasant social exchange rather than a strategic political maneuver, even when both parties understood the visit's real purpose. On a summer day in 1908 in Washington, D.C., 23-year-old Evelyn Walsh married Edward Ned Beale McLean, heir to the Washington Post newspaper and Cincinnati Enquirer publishing fortune, uniting two of the era's most substantial American fortunes in a match that newspapers covered with enthusiastic attention to every detail. The ceremony and reception were lavish, even by Washington standards, with society pages noting not only the bride's dress and the notable guests, but also the enormous scale of wedding gifts that included silver services, European artwork, and substantial checks from family friends whose generosity reflected both affection and calculated investment in maintaining good relations with two powerful families. The couple's subsequent European honeymoon trip, which extended for months and took them through England, France, Germany, and other fashionable destinations, provided material for society column coverage but also revealed patterns of extravagant spending that would characterize their marriage. In her memoir, written years later with a mixture of amused self-awareness and barely disguised regret, Evelyn recalled one particular episode that captured their casual relationship with enormous wealth. Impatient with having only one Mercedes automobile available during their stay in Leipzig, she and Ned went overnight to Paris by express train simply to purchase a second luxury car, an expenditure and journey that they treated as entirely routine rather than as the extraordinary indulgence that it obviously was. The line reads simultaneously as an amused confession. She recognized the absurdity even as she participated in it, and as documentary evidence of the financial expectations and spending patterns that surrounded wealthy, young couples whose combined inheritances seemed inexhaustible. Wedding correspondence preserved in family archives and examined by later biographers reveals that the union involved careful negotiations between the Walsh and McLean families regarding financial settlements, allowances that would be provided to the couple, travel funds, and the eventual disposition of family fortunes, a reminder that even seemingly romantic narratives of young love were grounded in meticulous legal and financial arithmetic designed to protect inherited wealth and ensure its orderly transfer across generations. On trains connecting European capitals, in grand hotels where they occupied the most expensive suites, and in shipboard salons during Atlantic crossings, Evelyn continued her habit of personally arranging flowers in their private sitting rooms, a small domestic ritual that provided continuity amid the constant movement, and that allowed her to impose a familiar sense of order on temporary lodgings. The carefully composed bouquets in crystal vases also served a practical purpose. They framed the young couple as newspaper photographers and society reporters wanted to see them. Beautiful, wealthy, perfectly matched, touched by fortune, rather than shadowed by any hint of future difficulty. The narrator reflects that when they returned to Washington as Mr. and Mrs. Edward Beale McLean to establish their own household and claim their position at the center of capital society, the practical question facing them was not whether they would successfully reign as a leading social couple. Their combined fortunes and family connections made that virtually certain, but rather what symbol or possession would come to define their particular version of wealth and power, what legendary object would become inseparable from their names and their place in American social history. By 1910, settled into the Massachusetts Avenue mansion as the married Mrs. Ned McLean, they initially lived with her parents before eventually acquiring their own properties. Evelyn presided over a complex household that seamlessly blended private domestic life with continuous public performance. Staff schedules reconstructed from payroll records and from published memoirs by members of Washington's servant class reveal the enormous labor required to maintain the mansion's operation. Silver that needed constant polishing to preserve its shine, elaborate menus that had to be planned days in advance and coordinated with wine selections appropriate to each course, and the nearly daily deliveries of fresh flowers that supplied the arrangements displayed throughout the public rooms for the constant succession of dinners, teas, and evening musicals that defined Washington social life. Evelyn's education in the demanding art of political hostessing continued through these years of early marriage. She refined her conversational French to handle diplomatic guests with greater fluency, practiced the delicate skill of introducing foreign ambassadors and American politicians who privately disliked each other but needed to maintain cordial public relations, mastered the arcane details of which wines should accompany which dishes at formal dinners, and developed the particular talent for making individual guests feel personally noticed and valued, even in rooms crowded with hundreds of people competing for attention. Contemporary observers and later historical accounts would describe her as a hostess magnificent, praising her truly regal style of hospitality that combined genuine warmth with carefully calculated strategic generosity. Formal photographs from 1910 and 1911, some reproduced in newspapers and others preserved in family albums, show Evelyn seated with Ned and their first child, an infant son named Vincent, after her deceased brother, in elaborately patterned rooms where every surface displays evidence of wealth and refined taste. Evelyn's gown is soft and flowing in the looser styles coming into fashion. Ned's expression is already slightly restless and distant, suggesting the temperamental instability and wandering attention that would later contribute to the marriage's deterioration. Between them, the baby stares seriously toward the camera, an heir to two substantial fortunes and to an intricate social machinery that had been constructed across generations long before his birth and that would continue to shape his life in ways neither parent could fully anticipate or control. As she arranged fresh flowers before each dinner party and formal reception, carefully selecting blooms that would complement the season and the event's tone, while ensuring that their scent would not overpower the dining room, Evelyn was performing a task that appeared merely decorative, but that actually served multiple functions. The arrangement signaled that the household was under proper management, that attention was being paid to aesthetic details, that the family understood how to create environments appropriate for entertaining Washington's political and diplomatic elite. More fundamentally, the ritual of arranging flowers offered a small domain of direct personal control in a life increasingly structured by social obligations, family expectations, and the demands of maintaining public image. The narrator observes that into this carefully constructed and maintained world of political dinners and diplomatic receptions, a Paris jeweler was about to introduce an object that would transform Evelyn from merely a wealthy Washington hostess into an international figure of fascination and eventually of superstitious fear, a 45-carat blue diamond with a documented history and an increasingly embroidered legend. In 1910, circulating between New York and Washington drawing rooms with the practiced persistence of a successful salesman, Pierre Cartier of the famous Paris jewelry firm began a careful campaign to position the Hope Diamond as a desirable acquisition for the McLeans, one of America's wealthiest young couples, and therefore ideal purchasers for an extraordinary gem whose price would require exceptional resources. The stone was a 45-carat deep blue diamond with a well-documented provenance tracing back through the Hope banking family of London, previous European owners, and ultimately, according to increasingly romantic accounts, to Indian mines where it had allegedly been stolen from a religious idol, a detail that fed into growing legends about the gem carrying a supernatural curse. Newspaper accounts from the period and later histories written by the Cartier family describe Pierre Cartier's sophisticated sales strategy. He carefully cultivated the McLean's interest by recounting the diamond's documented passage through European aristocratic collections, mentioning its connection to various romantic tragedies and unexplained misfortunes that had supposedly befallen previous owners, and deliberately keeping the stone veiled and unavailable for viewing until Evelyn's curiosity had been thoroughly stimulated. When she finally insisted on seeing the gem, she reportedly disliked its original antique setting and found it disappointing. Cartier, demonstrating the flexibility that had made his firm successful, agreed to have the stone completely reset as a modern pendant surrounded by smaller white diamonds, transforming it into a piece that suited contemporary taste rather than historical curiosity. On 28 January 1911, in a formal agreement signed in the offices of the Washington Post on L Street, using Ned's family newspaper headquarters as the site for finalizing the transaction, which itself suggests the businesslike nature of the purchase, Edward McLean completed the acquisition for approximately $180,000, an enormous sum that newspapers immediately reported, along with reminders of the stone's allegedly sinister reputation. The New York Times article covering the sale included a detailed list of previous owners and made prominent mention of the supposed curse, simultaneously reporting the factual transaction and feeding public fascination with the supernatural narrative that was already attaching itself to the diamond. Cartier, who had promoted these cursed stories as a marketing tool but who apparently retained some genuine unease about their possible validity, even included an unusual clause in the sales agreement allowing the McLeans to exchange the stone for other Cartier jewelry if a fatality occurred in their family within 6 months of the purchase, a provision that acknowledged the curse narrative while attempting to manage any resulting business liability. Evalyn, according to both her later published accounts and a PBS documentary that drew on her memoir and contemporary sources, reportedly responded to all the ominous warnings with characteristic defiance. Bad luck objects, she declared, for me are lucky, suggesting that she intended to reverse or neutralize any supernatural malevolence through sheer force of optimistic personality. She nevertheless took the practical precaution of having the diamond blessed at a Catholic church before wearing it publicly, a gesture that combined religious reassurance with an acknowledgement that the cursed stories, however implausible, had taken sufficient root in public consciousness that they required some form of ritual response. On the evening of 3 February 1912, at the Walsh McLean Mansion on Massachusetts Avenue where this narrative began, guests arriving for a formal dinner and reception filed past the grand 3-story entrance hall with its mahogany staircase, ascending to rooms where the Hope Diamond was displayed publicly for the first time since Cartier had sold it to the McLeans just over a year earlier. The New York Times Society coverage of the event, published the following day, described the reception as brilliant and devoted considerable attention to the famous blue stone. It hung from a platinum chain against Evalyn's lace bodice, surrounded by its new setting of smaller white diamonds that caught and multiplied the light, the entire arrangement designed to draw and hold observers' attention on the extraordinary central gem. Over the subsequent decade from 1912 through the early 1920s, contemporary photographs, society column mentions, and later reminiscences by Washington observers documented that Evalyn wore the Hope Diamond with a frequency and casualness that seemed deliberately calculated to challenge its allegedly cursed nature. She appeared with it at formal diplomatic balls and political receptions, certainly, but also reportedly wore the extraordinary gem at breakfast in her own home, while making ordinary social calls on friends in the afternoon, and even, according to some accounts, while walking her dogs in the gardens. She transformed the diamond into a kind of game or entertainment at large parties, playing hide the hope with guests, tucking the 45-carat stone in garden plantings, or tying it with a ribbon around the neck of her Great Dane, while visitors searched the estate grounds for it, treating one of the world's most valuable gems as an elaborate prop for amusement, rather than as an object requiring constant security and reverent handling. The diamond functioned as both a spectacular ornament and a practical social tool in Evalyn's Washington reign. Its presence at her entertainments drew ambassadors seeking stories to report back to European capitals, politicians wanting to be seen at fashionable gatherings, journalists hoping for glimpses of the famous stone, and society figures whose attendance confirmed an event's importance, all of which consolidated Evalyn's position as an essential hostess at the center of Washington political and diplomatic social life. Behind the public spectacle, however, practical business records including insurance policies, security service invoices, and bank vault rental agreements reveal the less romantic logistics of owning such an object, the substantial ongoing costs of protecting it, the complex arrangements required for its safekeeping when not being worn, and the constant concern about theft that made the casual hide-the-hope games simultaneously daring and anxiety-producing. Throughout these years, fresh flowers continued to frame both the woman and the stone. Elaborate arrangements on tables where she stood receiving guests, in the garden beds where she sometimes concealed the diamond during her games, and in the vases that lined the rooms where she moved through Washington society, wearing the blue stone that had become inseparable from her identity. Beauty was multiplied around the object that supposedly carried danger, as if sufficient quantities of roses and lilies and orchids might somehow neutralize or dilute whatever curse the diamond was alleged to bear. On 19th May 1919, at the McLean family's country estate called Friendship, located on what were then the rural outskirts of Washington, D.C., an extensive property with landscaped grounds, elaborate gardens, and its own private roads, 9-year-old Vincent Walsh McLean slipped away from the guards and servants assigned to watch him and ran toward the public road that bordered the estate. He was struck and killed by an automobile directly in front of his family's property, a tragedy that the New York Times reported the following day under the stark, factual headline, "McLean Heir Killed by an Automobile." The journalistic plainness of the language unable to capture the devastating loss for parents who had believed their wealth could protect their children from such ordinary modern dangers. The Historic American Buildings Survey documentation on the Walsh McLean house, compiled decades later when the mansion's history was being formally recorded, includes a summary of the family's major tragedies and notes that young Vincent's death, along with other misfortunes, was often ascribed to the Hope Diamond's legendary curse, the survey's careful phrasing suggesting scholarly distance from supernatural explanations, while acknowledging that these attributions had become part of the diamond's documented cultural history. In actual fact, removed from legend and examined as a matter of documented reality, the accident represented a tragically common hazard of the early automobile age. The collision of new transportation technology with children's ancient patterns of play and exploration, a danger that haunted many wealthy estates where private grounds bordered public roads, where speeds and traffic patterns were still poorly regulated. Newspapers and popular magazine articles about the Hope Diamond published in subsequent decades would nevertheless systematically fold this loss into the gem's growing mythology of supernatural malevolence. First, her brother Vincent Walsh killed in an automobile accident in 1905, the accounts would note, and now her son. Vincent McLean dead in another automotive tragedy 14 years later. 2 deaths in one extended family, both involving the relatively new technology of motor vehicles, both occurring after enormous wealth had entered the family but framed in popular retellings as evidence of a curse, rather than as examples of the democratizing nature of modern danger that struck wealthy and poor families alike. Inside the rooms at Friendship in the weeks and months following the accident, flower arrangements continued to appear in their customary places during the social events that eventually resumed, but contemporary photographs and later biographical accounts suggest subtle changes in Evalyn's demeanor. A slightly more rigid posture, a more fixed quality to her smile, the sense of someone performing familiar social rituals while increasingly separated from genuine engagement with them. Biographical sources note that her use of morphine, which had begun as legitimate pain management after her own accident in 1905, but which had been maintained at relatively controlled levels for years, deepened significantly during the 1920s as she attempted to navigate overwhelming grief while still maintaining her exhausting public schedule of entertaining and social obligations. The narrator observes that what newspapers called a curse and what popular culture increasingly accepted as supernatural malevolence looked, in actual documented fact, like a mother continuing to turn a famous jewel in her hands, wearing it to parties and dinners, while the grand house at Friendship grew progressively quieter around her, despite the crowds that still gathered for receptions. By the early 1930s, the McLean marriage, strained for years by Ned's well-documented infidelities with other women, his increasingly reckless personal spending that alarmed even a family accustomed to enormous expenditure, and his erratic behavior that suggested deepening psychological instability, finally entered the courts through divorce proceedings that brought private dysfunction into unavoidable public scrutiny. Evalyn's parents, Thomas and Carrie Walsh, had expressed serious reservations about the match before the 1908 wedding, concerns that biographical sources indicate were based on observable patterns in Ned's personality and behavior. Their worries, dismissed at the time as parental overcaution or snobbery, had proven grimly prescient. During 1932 and 1933, while divorce proceedings moved through legal channels, Ned made increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control over his financial affairs and avoid unfavorable court judgments, even going so far as to establish legal residence in Riga, Latvia, choosing that distant location specifically to pursue a foreign divorce that might be more favorable to his interest than any domestic proceeding. Simultaneously, court-appointed trustees moved to protect the Washington Post newspaper from Ned's financial mismanagement, which had become so severe that it threatened the viability of his family's most valuable business asset and the source of much of the McLean fortune. On 31st October 1933, following extensive medical examinations and legal testimony about his behavior and mental state, a Maryland jury formally declared Edward Beale McLean legally insane, a determination that led to his immediate commitment to Shepherd and Enoch Pratt Hospital in Towson, Maryland, where he would remain institutionalized until his death in 1941. The same legal records note that Evalyn's pending divorce suit was formally dropped after the insanity verdict, a procedural outcome dictated by laws that prevented divorce from a spouse who had been legally declared mentally incompetent, leaving her in the ambiguous position of being married to a man who was permanently institutionalized and with whom she had no meaningful relationship, but from whom she could not be legally separated. During these same difficult years of the early 1930s, Evalyn became the victim of an elaborate confidence scheme perpetrated by Gaston Means, a con artist with previous criminal convictions who approached her, claiming that he could secure the release of the kidnapped Lindbergh baby, the case that had horrified the nation, in exchange for a large cash ransom. Believing his story and desperate to help end the Lindbergh family's agonizing uncertainty, Evalyn mortgaged property and, according to some accounts, temporarily pawned jewels, including potentially the Hope Diamond itself, to raise over $100,000 in cash that she delivered to Means before discovering that the entire scheme was fraudulent. Her testimony ultimately helped secure Means's conviction and imprisonment, but the episode demonstrated both her continued vulnerability to manipulation and the increasing precariousness of her own financial position despite the still substantial underlying wealth. Society pages in Washington newspapers continued recording dinners and receptions where Evalyn appeared wearing the Hope Diamond and maintaining her role as prominent hostess. The stark contrast between the glittering blue stone, the elaborate fresh flower arrangements that still decorated her entertaining spaces, and the mounting personal debts, legal complications, and emotional devastation occurring behind the public facade illustrated how long social performance could be sustained even as the foundations of stability crumbled beneath it. In the late 1910s and throughout the 1920s, Evalyn's extraordinarily active social life unfolded against the backdrop of seismic political and cultural transformations that she both witnessed and, in small ways, participated in shaping. She developed a close friendship with Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Theodore Roosevelt's famously sharp-tongued daughter, who had herself married into Washington's political establishment and later became intimate friends with Florence Harding, sharing regular bridge games and informal movie outings with the woman, who would become First Lady when Warren Harding assumed the presidency in 1921, as documented in multiple biographies of Washington's prominent social women and in contemporary newspaper society coverage. In 1917, shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution had overthrown the Russian imperial government and thrown that nation into civil war and chaos, Evalyn and Ned McLean undertook a highly publicized and somewhat quixotic journey to revolutionary Russia, ostensibly attempting to use their wealth and influence to restore Ned's uncle George Bakhmetev to his position as Russian ambassador to the United States, a position that had become meaningless once the government he represented had been violently overthrown. According to an often repeated anecdote preserved in diplomatic memoirs and later historical accounts, American diplomat William Bullitt, who was attempting to establish practical working relationships with the new Soviet authorities, found it necessary to physically dissuade Evelyn from wearing the Hope Diamond openly on Moscow's dangerous streets, where she had apparently planned to display it as a deliberate symbol of capitalist wealth and superiority. A gesture that would almost certainly have resulted in her being robbed and possibly killed, and that Bullitt correctly understood as representing a profound misreading of the revolutionary moment and its dangers. During and after World War I, Evelyn hosted numerous benefit events for wounded veterans and war relief organizations, appearing in newspaper photographs adorned with her famous jewels, including the Hope Diamond. The displays of wealth now explicitly reframed as patriotic duty and charitable generosity. The familiar flower-laden tables and the gleam of crystal glassware and expensive china continued to provide settings for these events, but the mansion's role had subtly shifted. It now functioned as a kind of civic theater where private privilege performed public patriotism, where great wealth demonstrated its social value through strategic philanthropy. As the Great Depression deepened during the early 1930s, fundamentally altering American economic and social life, the world of elaborate private entertainment that had sustained Evelyn's role as prominent hostess began contracting. Court-ordered trusteeship arrangements designed to protect what remained of family fortunes from Ned's mismanagement, accumulating unpaid bills from merchants and service providers, and the eventual forced sales of properties and possessions, all bear documented witness to the steady erosion of wealth that had once seemed infinite and permanent. In this rapidly changing historical landscape, where the old certainties of inherited wealth and automatic social deference were being fundamentally questioned, the ritual of arranging fresh flowers for dinner parties took on different significance. What had once been an assertion of power and control, the ability to command beauty and impose aesthetic order, became something closer to an act of continuity and perhaps defiance, a determination to maintain a particular vision of civilized Washington social life for one more evening, one more dinner, one more reception, even as the economic and cultural foundations supporting that vision were visibly crumbling. The narrator observes that Evelyn's most devastating personal losses during her later life would come not from stock market crashes or newspaper headlines about financial scandal, but from the private rooms of her own houses where no amount of wealth or public performance could provide any protection against tragedy. On 20th of September 1946, in Asheville, North Carolina, where the younger generation of McLeans maintained properties separate from the Washington houses, Evelyn's only surviving daughter, Evelyn Washington Evie McLean Reynolds, died at age 24 from what a coroner's inquest reported in both regional North Carolina newspapers and the New York Times officially ruled an accidental overdose of sleeping pills. Contemporary accounts and later family histories emphasize the particularly devastating detail that it was Evelyn herself who discovered her daughter's body, finding the young woman dead in circumstances that no amount of maternal devotion or desperate hope could reverse. Less than a year after this shattering loss, on 26 April 1947, Evelyn Walsh McLean died of pneumonia in Washington, D.C. at age 60. Her obituary in the New York Times appeared under the headline Hostess Magnificent, a phrase that captured both her decades-long reign as one of Washington's most prominent social figures and the newspaper's difficulty in knowing how else to summarize a life that had encompassed extraordinary wealth, legendary jewels, devastating personal tragedies, and a complicated legacy of both genuine generosity and spectacular excess. The obituary noted that Washington will hardly seem the same gay city without her presence, acknowledging that her death marked the end of a particular era of capital social life, and summarized the pattern of spectacular hospitality interwoven with equally spectacular misfortune that had defined her public narrative. She was buried in Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington, laid to rest in the substantial Walsh family tomb beside her daughter Evie, the two women who had borne the family name joining in death after lives shaped by wealth's promises and failures. Evelyn's will placed the Hope Diamond and her other extraordinary jewelry collection in trust for her surviving grandchildren, an attempt to preserve family wealth across generations and provide for descendants who might restore the family's fortunes and reputation. However, Court records from subsequent legal proceedings document that trustees were eventually granted judicial permission to sell the jewelry collection, the sale being deemed necessary to generate funds sufficient to cover the substantial debts that had accumulated during the final years of Evalyn's life, despite the underlying wealth that still existed on paper. In 1949, New York jeweler Harry Winston, one of the era's most prominent dealers in exceptional gems, purchased the entire collection, including the Hope Diamond, in November 1958 in a gesture that combined genuine philanthropy with extraordinary publicity. Winston donated the famous blue stone to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History, where it was installed as the centerpiece of the gem collection and where it remains on public display more than 6 decades later. Visitors to the Smithsonian today encounter the Hope Diamond displayed under carefully controlled museum lighting set against dark velvet in a secure case that allows observation from multiple angles while protecting the stone from theft or damage. The museum's interpretive materials discuss the gem's documented history through European collections, mention the various tragic legends that have attached themselves to it, and provide scientific analysis of its unusual deep blue color and other gemological properties. In the many period photographs that museums and archives preserve showing Evalyn wearing the diamond during the 1910s through 1940s, it typically hangs at her throat above cascades of pearls and other jewels. Behind her in these images, as often as not, stand elaborate floral arrangements, roses, lilies, orchids that have long since faded and been discarded, while the diamond itself has remained essentially unchanged by the passage of time, brilliant and self-contained and fundamentally indifferent to the human dramas that have temporarily surrounded it. The first time this narrative observed Evalyn McLean, it was the cold morning of 3rd February 1912, in a Washington dining room that smelled of orchids and coffee, her fingers adjusting white roses in a low bowl while the Hope Diamond rested heavy against her lace bodice. A private ritual of arranging beauty, performed in the hours before guests would arrive to see the famous stone publicly displayed for the first time under her ownership. The final image belongs not to a ballroom or diplomatic reception, but to a climate-controlled museum gallery. The same blue diamond now suspended in its circle of white diamonds within a sealed display case at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, surrounded not by Washington senators and foreign ambassadors, but by tourists speaking in lowered voices, by school groups shepherded past by teachers, by visitors from around the world who pause briefly to photograph the gem before moving on to the next exhibit. Somewhere in archival storage boxes at the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, and in family collections, period photographs still exist showing flower-filled vases lining the mantels and sideboards of the McLean mansion. Roses and lilies and orchids captured at the exact moment of their arranged perfection, before the inevitable fading and wilting that would require their removal and replacement with fresh blooms, the cycle repeating endlessly as long as someone remained to continue the ritual. Grace, in this story that has traced Evalyn's life from Colorado mining office to Washington mansion to Rock Creek Cemetery burial ground, reveals itself as simultaneously art and architecture, a thing carefully arranged and constantly rearranged, requiring daily labor and attention to maintain, yet ultimately temporary and unable to provide actual protection against the fundamental vulnerabilities of human existence. The diamond, meanwhile, remains essentially unchanged, still throwing back light with the same blue fire that caught Evalyn's attention when Pierre Cartier first showed it to her, still generating fascination and drawing crowds, still accumulating new stories and interpretations, while the woman who wore it to formal receptions and reportedly to breakfast, who played games hiding it in her garden and tied it around her dog's neck, who believed or tried to believe that owning it would somehow prove her immunity to the misfortunes that had already marked her life, now lies beneath the earth of Rock Creek, while the rooms where she once adjusted flowers have been repurposed for new owners with different rituals and different needs. The curse, if such a thing ever existed in any form beyond superstitious narrative and journalistic embellishment, and the human need to find supernatural explanations for the random cruelties that strike both wealthy and poor families, is no longer the relevant question. The documented deaths and tragedies in the Walsh and McLean families occurred, certainly, the automobile accidents, the failed marriage, the daughter's fatal overdose, but nothing in the factual record requires or supports supernatural causation when human frailty and modern danger and plain statistical misfortune provide sufficient explanation. What persists beyond the cursed narratives in the society columns and the archive photographs is a quieter and more difficult question. What did it cost, in terms of human experience and authentic selfhood and the possibility of genuine rather than performed emotion, to live a life so elaborately arranged around a single extraordinary object, to spend decades adjusting roses and wearing a famous blue stone and entertaining ambassadors and maintaining public performance even as private foundations crumbled? The question remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, suspended in the same careful silence that Evelyn maintained in so many of those preserved photographs, her smile perfect and her posture impeccable, and her hands, when they are visible, either gloved in expensive leather or resting lightly on flower stems, arranging beauty one more time.